Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. This is the second lesson on the Great War. But this time we're taking a more narrative approach to the first half of the war up to 1917. But you'll remember that the conditions were in place such that very quickly after the assassination of the Archduke, Europeans are drawn into a conflict with other Europeans, but now it's not just Europeans. We've got the Ottomans and the Japanese involved. But in order to sort of start the narrative of how the war unfolds, we got to back up just a little bit because Germany had this plan in place before the war broke out. What their biggest concern was, they did not want to fight a war on two fronts. They had spent all this money building up their military might, and they felt like they lost an advantage. If they had to split up their troops and send half of them, let's say, to the west and half of them to the east, they lost what they thought was their military advantage. So the idea was this plan would be a way to avoid having to fight a war on two fronts for very long. In essence, the idea was that the German troops would sweep through countries that at the time had been neutral, unopposed, very, very quickly, engage with the French, and then just overwhelm them as fast as possible. Then, once they've conquered France, they would take most of those troops, assign them to go fight Russia on the Eastern Front. Obviously, they'd have to leave some troops behind to maintain the occupation of France. But the plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was to knock out the French as fast as possible so they wouldn't have to fight a war on two fronts. The reality of that, though, is a little bit different. And that becomes really clear at what is known as the Battle of the Marne. Because what that reveals is that World War I is not going to be fought the way that people thought it was going to be going into the war. In fact, the Western Front is going to become a straight stalemate. If you look at this map, you can see the Marne River down here. The Germans did initially push into France, but then the French pushed back. And then what happens along this line is a new type of warfare called trench warfare. Trench warfare is absolutely horribly brutal. Obviously, if you look at the conditions here, the men being stuck in the trenches and mud and filth and their own waste, and they can't move. But here's the point. Most of the people that enlisted for their respective sides at the beginning really thought they were doing this for glory. And their image of war was, men on horses with swords and, maybe carrying around cannons and rifles and stuff. But it was still very much a sort of older style of warfare. Trench warfare makes it very clear, though, this isn't going to be the way it is. Once you establish your trench system, the other side has done the same, it becomes almost impossible to move the lines. And the biggest reason for that is this place in the middle between the two lines called no man's land. It's literally the case that in order to advance your line, you have to send troops out of their trench and out into open space. Well, when they do that, the other side, who now has machine guns, we'll get into that later on, simply just mows down those people indiscriminately. And so this idea of no man's land is because no man who goes out there is going to survive. And both sides know this, and yet the only way you can advance is you have to do it. A gruesome, brutal type of warfare that no one anticipated going into the war. Now, so it's a stalemate for the German West. But what about on the East? Because they do send some of their troops to fight the Russians at the same time. But there, the situation becomes really clear in what is known as the Battle of Tannenberg. So here's what's going on. The Germans send troops eastward and engage the Russian First Army here. And the Russians actually win. But here's what the Germans do. If you look at this, there is a railway system right here. So what they do is they put all their troops on this railway system, and evacuate them to the southeast. Now, that's a new twist, right? It's not soldiers marching on foot. It's instead hop on a train and get the heck out of there really, really fast. But the Germans are on the run. And down here is the Russian Second Army. The original idea was the Russians were going to sort of trap them, but they moved so fast on their retreat because of the railways. The Second Army is still hanging down here by Tannenberg. Now, the Germans will regroup here and realize they're going to re-engage the Russians, but here's the real twist. The Russian First Army, after defeating the Germans and forcing them to run, never gets word that the plan is they're supposed to follow them and then come in behind them. It's a failure of communication by the military. And if you recall, going back to the great reforms of Alexander the Second and the Third, that was an issue that had always been a problem for the Russian military. And it becomes really quickly clear with the Battle of Tannenberg that they haven't fixed this problem. Like, there's still fundamental issues wrong with the Russian military. The Second Army is instead surrounded and defeated at the Battle of Tannenberg, and this, as we'll see, has serious consequences in Russia. They had them outmanned, they had them outgunned, they had them on the run. They should have defeated the Germans right there, but because of poor communications, not only did they fail to stop the Germans end up winning the Battle of Tannenberg, again, because of poor communications. As a consequence, then, the thing Germany didn't want, fighting a war on two fronts, is exactly what happens. Now, if you look at this map, you'll notice there's not a whole lot of movement on the Western Front because of trench warfare. Trench warfare, not so much a thing on the Eastern Front, but as you will see, the line moves pretty significantly until eventually 1918, but we'll come back to that in a later video, what's going on there. The basic idea, though, the theater of war, that's the place where the war is taking place in Europe. It's a two-front war for the Central Powers. But that's not the only place the war is going on. For example, it's happening in Asia and Oceania as well. There we've got Japan in on the action. Now, Japan joins the Allies. Why does it do that? It wants German territories. When Germany is aligned against Britain, France, and Russia, the Japanese see this as an opportunity to take territories that, frankly, they thought should have been theirs in the first place. And chief among those is this port Qingdao, which the Japanese thought, if you recall, when they carved up the spheres of influence, they thought that should have been theirs in the first place. Instead, it was given to Germany. So the Japanese then attack the Germans in Qingdao, but also all of these little islands that were colonies of Germany as well. Their basic role, though, is they're basically keeping the Germans occupied in Asia and Oceania. Germany is spending most of its efforts either primarily in Europe, but also in Africa, as we'll see in just a second. But their job is basically you handle the Germans out here so that the other allies don't really have to spend a whole lot of effort to do this. In addition to Asia and Oceania, though, the war is also taking place in the Middle East. But here the situation is really complex. The Ottoman Empire, if you recall, there's Turkish nationalism rising. There was this struggle of power after the soft revolution between the young Turks and the young Ottomans, but Turkish nationalism is growing. The sense that there should be a Turkish nation state as opposed to a multi-ethnic empire. Nonetheless, they decide to join the Central Powers in the war. Now, why did they do this? Well, first of all, it's the case they didn't trust the British and the French and the Russians because they felt like they were all trying to chip away their territory, which they were. There was no sense that any of them wanted to form an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. They also calculated, though, that Germany had the tactical advantage. So they kind of thought the side with Germany was going to be the winning side. Moreover, they were hoping to form some sort of agreement with the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the war that would allow them to maybe take back some of the territories in southeastern Europe that had broken away and gotten their independence. Regardless of their decision, though, it's a pretty fateful one, because now the British are going to get involved in toppling the Ottoman Empire. How do they do that? Well, they lead an Arab revolt against the Ottomans, claiming nationalism of a new sort. This guy, T.E. Lawrence, is actually an officer, a British officer stationed in Arabia, and he starts going around spreading the idea of Arab nationalism, that Arabs should have their own state, separate from the Ottoman Empire, which by now is dominated by Turkish nationalists. So he's gathering all of this support to try to get Arabs to attack the Ottoman Empire with the goal ultimately of getting their own state. So the plan is that T.E. Lawrence is going to lead Arabs in a revolt against the Turks leading the Ottoman Empire from the south. Meanwhile, the other allies are going to attack the Ottoman Empire from the north. So they're going to sort of smash the Turks right in the middle of this. That's the plan. Does not happen that way at all. Why not? Well, first of all, the Arabs are simply outgunned. Camels are great for any sort of desert transportation, but even if you have a guy on a camel with a rifle, that's not the nature of warfare anymore. And so they're terribly outgunned in their attempt to move towards the Turks in the northern part of the Ottoman Empire. But the other part has to do with the northern part. If you look in the circle on this map, it's tough to see because it's blurry. There's a little peninsula there called Gallipoli. And the idea was that the other Allied troops were all going to meet at Gallipoli, take Istanbul, the capital city, and then sort of smash them coming from both the north and the south. The problem, though, is it doesn't go that way. A classic example of this is seen as what's known as the ANZAC, which stands for the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. So colonists, British colonists from Austria and New Zealand who are recruited into the force are sent to Gallipoli. They make a landing on a beach there, and they are really, really wiped out. The problem in both cases, the attack from the north signified by the failure at Gallipoli, but also the Arabs from the south, they just did not get the military support from the rest of the Allied troops. They didn't have any help, essentially, and so the Ottomans were able to repel them, even though they had their more military problems. Nonetheless, there's all sorts of seeds planted here that are going to lead to issues in the Middle East that we'll get to later on. Finally, then, we've got the case of Africa. Now, if you look at the colonies in Africa, particularly after the Berlin Conference, what you're going to notice is among the Central Powers, the only one that really has anything going on here are the Germans, right? So the Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't a thing when they did all of this. The Ottoman Empire lost most of their territory before all of this happened in Africa. It's really the Germans. But look where the German colonies are, because that's the key. Now, this is a term we're going to come back to a lot in the remainder of this course, geopolitics. Geopolitics is basically that a place is important simply because of its strategic location. Like, it's not necessarily about the resources that are there, but because of its relation to where other people have colonies or territories and what you might want to do. So if you go back to I would say one of the earliest examples of this, when the Germans got what they called German East Africa, Why was that important? It was important because they were trying to block what the British were trying to do. It was a geopolitical decision. But they're surrounded by the British here, but notice where the Portuguese colonies are. They're right next to the Germans in both of their two big colonies. Portugal will join the Allies primarily because they realize the German colonies right next to theirs in Africa are a potential threat to them. On the other hand, if you notice, Spain does not ever join one side or the other. They remain neutral. Why? Well, look at where their African colonies are. They're not under a particular threat one way or another. They don't feel like France is a threat to them, for example, as long as they stay neutral. So there's no geopolitical reason for them to get involved. There's no strategic geographical threat to them in the case of Africa. Now, an issue that we're going to come back to later on, though, is how does this affect all the colonial subjects there? Because it's not just the British and the Germans and the French that are involved in this. It's the people who are actually in those colonies. And they're affected in multiple ways. There's fighting on their territory where they live, but then there are also colonial subjects. That's a topic that we'll come back to later on. So here's the big idea. We get these shifting alliances that suck all of these people in, not just in Europe, but beyond. In Europe, the fighting is taking place on two fronts. The Western Front, where trench warfare has bogged them down. On the Eastern Front, it's not so much trench warfare, but it's clear the Russians are not capable of sort of meeting the German aggression quite so effectively. We've also got fighting with the Japanese centering the Allied threat there in Asia and Oceania. The Middle East becomes a quagmire of its own. Now we've got Arab nationalism as a part of it. We've got a lack of military support, and then all sorts of issues involving the location of the colonies in Africa. But what you may have noticed is the Americas are largely left out of this equation. So what is going on there? That's a topic we'll come back to in a later lesson because it is involved, but not necessarily in a way that's as straightforward as in some of these other areas. I want to thank you for your attention. Again, this is sort of a narrative version of the war up to 1917, so like the first half of the war. How you take notes on this part is particularly unique to you. Whether you take notes at all is your choice, which is a little bit different from the causes and effects lessons that we've been doing and will do in the future. Nonetheless, I do appreciate your attention, so thank you, and we'll see you in the next lesson.